It says, H.P. Lovecraft understood that to be truly frightening, weird tales of supernatural horror must force us to confront the vast indifference of the cosmos and to recognize that human beings are as insignificant as specks of dust. Although he only had a small readership during his short lifetime, 1890 to 1937, Lovecraft has influenced generations of writers, and today he is acknowledged to be an important, albeit minor, figure in the American literary pantheon. Lovecraft's literary fame is modest in comparison with his modernist contemporaries such as T.S. Eliot, Ernest Hemingway, and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Yet his cultural influence has been dramatic and substantial. While virtually all writers of supernatural horror of the past 100 years trace their parentage back to Edgar Allan Poe, Lovecraft helped pave the way for such modern masters of contemporary American Gothic fiction as Stephen King, Clive Barker, and Neil Gaiman, as well as a host of emerging authors such as Lyad Barron and Thomas Ligotti. I probably butchered those names. Lovecraft's relatively small body of fiction is of such quality and originality, especially his stories, The Call of Cthulhu, The Whispers in Darkness, The Colour Out of Space, The Shadow Out of Time, and his novellas, The Shadow over Innsmouth and At the Mountains of Madness, that it not only established him as the leading writer of weird fiction among his contemporaries, but it also secured him a well-deserved place in American literary history. Howard Phillips Lovecraft was born on August 20, 1890, in Providence, Rhode Island, to Sarah Susan Phillips Lovecraft and Winfield Scott Lovecraft. His parents had a reasonable claim and arguably the pretensions to match to old New England aristocracy, with a maternal line that could be traced back to the first waves of settlers in the 17th century and a long paternal line of English stock. Additionally, they were fortunate to have wealth to match their affections, thanks to the business success of Lovecraft's maternal grandfather, Whipple Van Buren Phillips. That is quite the name. Tragedy befell the family, however, when Lovecraft's father, a travelling salesman, suffered a severe breakdown in 1893. He spent the next 5 years in a sanitarium and died in 1898 of, it has been speculated, syphilitic paralysis. I think young Howard was largely raised by his mother, her 2 sisters, and their father. Lovecraft's already distressed circumstances grew considerably worse when his grandfather died in 1904, for the family's firm financial footing disappeared. Lovecraft and his mother, with whom he had a strained relationship, were forced to move into a smaller home. No doubt these family troubles affected the young Lovecraft both physically and mentally. As a teenager, he suffered from a variety of illnesses, many of them, it would seem, connected more to his psychological condition than to biological ailments. Lovecraft responded to these adolescent stresses by pouring his energies into reading and writing. He was particularly drawn to books on science and antiquarian history, as well as Gothic fiction, and his early love for Poe, whom he first discovered at the age of 8, stayed with him throughout his life. A nervous breakdown in 1908 prevented Lovecraft from receiving his high school diploma, the classics and taught himself enough Latin to do some minor translation of classical works. His love of science expressed itself through a fascination with chemistry and astronomy, and much of his earliest writings were in these fields. While still a young boy, he developed a keen interest in amateur journalism and produced his own periodicals, the Scientific Gazette, which ran from 1899 to 1907, and the Rhode Island Journal of Astronomy, which ran from 1903 to 1907. In his mid-teens, he began to contribute occasional articles on various scientific topics to the Providence Tribune, the Providence Evening News, and other local newspapers. Not much is known about the 5 years following Lovecraft's nervous breakdown. He continued his reading and self-education, but he largely kept to himself. His early interest in journalism and magazine production gradually brought Lovecraft back into public life. In 1914, he was invited to join the United Amateur Press Association, UAPA, one of 2 national organizations. The other was the National Amateur Press Association, which Lovecraft was also later joined, whose members wrote and published their own independent magazines. For Lovecraft, the invitation to join the UAPA was a small salvation, rescuing him from the cycle of lethargy and depression that had consumed him in his early 20s. His considerable talents as a writer and his extensive literary and scientific background proved just the right mix for a young man now interested in making his mark in the field of journalism, and he quickly became a prominent figure within the UAPA. He produced his own magazine, The Conservative, which ran for 13 issues from 1915 to 1923, and he contributed dozens of articles to other amateur journals. He also served as editor of the official journal of the UAPA, the United Amateur, and later even served as president of the rival NAPA. This revitalization also helped motivate Lovecraft to write fiction again. He had produced a few minor short stories in his mid-teens, including The Beast in the Cave, 1905, and The Alchemist, 1908. But he had set aside fiction writing during the quiet years following his breakdown. In the mid-1910s, however, at the urging of friends associated with the UAPA, Lovecraft decided to try his hand at fiction again, and he produced 2 short stories in 1917, The Tomb and Dagon. These 2 stories, for all practical purposes, mark the beginning of Lovecraft's professional writing career as a master of the weird tale. Although Lovecraft wrote prolifically throughout the rest of his life, fiction was not his primary mode of expression. He wrote journalism, poetry, essays, and a mountain of correspondence, the sum of which makes his fictional output, some 60 or so stories and a few short novels, seem quite thin by comparison. But it is upon these stories that Lovecraft's considerable reputation rests. Lovecraft published his fiction in a variety of amateur and start-up professional journals edited by associates in the UAPA and NAPA, as well as in the emerging pulp magazines that specialized in genre fiction. One of these pulp magazines, Weird Tales, gradually became his principal publisher. In the late 1920s and early 1930s, Lovecraft and Weird Tales came to be associated with one another by the small but dedicated cohort of readers and writers of supernatural horror fiction. In 1921, Lovecraft's mother passed away after a husband had spent his final years. Shortly after her death, Lovecraft met Sonia Green at a convention for amateur journalists, and they began a courtship. 7 years his senior, Sonia was the proprietor of a hat shop in New York and also wrote stories with supernatural themes. They married in 1924, and Lovecraft joined Sonia in New York. Their marriage was not a happy one. Lovecraft did not feel at home in New York, and he failed to find satisfactory employment. Compounding their misery, Sonia's shop failed, and she suffered from bouts of ill health that required her to spend considerable time away at sanatoriums. Eventually, Sonia moved to Cleveland to pursue new employment, and in 1926, Lovecraft returned with relief to Providence. Although they explored the idea of Sonia joining him in Providence, his aunts decided there was no room in the Lovecraft family for a working woman, and Lovecraft was unequal to the task of standing up to them on Sonia's behalf. They divorced in 1929. Lovecraft did not remarry. Lovecraft's return to Providence initiated his greatest period as a writer of weird tales, beginning with The Call of Cthulhu in 1926. He wrote many of his most notable works in the following years, including his greatest single statement on the significance and meaning of the weird tale, The Study Supernatural Horror in Literature, 1927. In 1927, he penned The Color Out of Space and The Case of Charles Dexter Ward. Color was published that same year in Amazing Stories, but Dexter Ward only appeared in print in Weird Tales in 1941, and in 1928 he wrote The Dunwich Horror, published in 1929 in Weird Tales. In 1930 he wrote The Whisperer in Darkness, published in Weird Tales in 1931, which was followed in 1931 by At the Mountains of Madness, which appeared in Outstanding Stories in 1936, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, published in 1936. The Shadow Out of Time was written in 1934, published in Outstanding Stories in 1936. These works, along with several dozen other lesser-known but strange and imaginative pieces, make up the heart and soul of Lovecraft's weird canon, and they have served as models of the genre for generations since. Despite the quality and originality of his literary output, Lovecraft's work was not commercially published in his lifetime. Only The Shadow over Innsmouth appeared in book form while he was alive, released by a small press in 1936 and not widely distributed. His reputation remained a product of his association with weird tales and other pulps and small magazines. It is fair to say that Lovecraft's popularity today and his rising literary reputation owe much to the work of several of his peers, especially fellow weird fiction writers and aficionados August Derleth and Donald Wanderer, who, starting with the collection The Outsider and Others in 1939, brought Lovecraft's works out of obscurity and preserved them in book form. Unfortunately, the commercial success of Lovecraft's fiction and his subsequent literary fame all came after his untimely passing. During the months leading up to his death, Lovecraft ignored and left untreated the symptoms of intestinal cancer, and when he finally sought help, it was too late. He entered the hospital on March 10, 1937, and on March 15 he was dead. Tales of supernatural horror, weird tales, have a long and rich rich history in Anglo-American literature. The weird tale of the early 20th century is a direct descendant of the Gothic romance tradition of the late 18th and early 19th centuries in England and America. Starting with the publication of The Castle of Otranto by the English author Horace Walpole in 1765, numerous writers in England and America turned their pens to dark tales of supernatural and preternatural horror. Featuring castles, dark subterranean passages, secret societies, madmen, graveyards, hidden manuscripts and ghosts, these tales were largely explorations of how humans are torn between good and evil, between God and the devil, and frequently choose the latter. Starting with Charles Brockden Brown's novel Highland, 1798. The American literary tradition in particular is filled with authors who turn to the artistic possibilities of Gothic fiction as a means to explore the human condition. This was most notable in the first half of the 19th century, when Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Herman Melville, and scores of others wrote tales on dark themes marked by a sense of preternatural dread. In the late 19th century, a time better known for its literary realism, even such realist pillars as Henry James occasionally abandoned the drawing room and drafted supernatural tales like The Turn of the Screw, 1898. On the other side of the Atlantic, Lord Dunsany, Arthur Machen, Algernon Blackwood, Bram Stoker, and other Victorian fantasy writers kept the Gothic tradition alive and well with their strange tales of occult activities, unknown terrors, secret societies, and grotesque monsters. Along with Poe, these authors were among the principal influences on Lovecraft, and as he developed his own writing style, he relied heavily on their examples. Tales of supernatural horror do much more than simply induce a chill in the reader. They also serve as a reminder that our knowledge of the world in which we live is incomplete. There are wonders in the cosmos that exist outside of our comprehension, and horror fiction forces us to confront what lies beyond. Thus, the weird tale is often a symbolic form in which the human condition is revealed to be precarious at best. The narrowness of our understanding of the world gives us a false sense of security. Ignorance of the truly monstrous nature of the cosmos is our only comfort, for when the veil is dropped and the horrors of the universe are revealed to us, we are forced to come to terms with our insignificance. The decorum of modern civilization provides only a thin barrier against the cosmos and ever-present pressures ensuring our eventual destruction. The monsters in supernatural horror literature are symbolic renderings of these ubiquitous, but usually unseen and unknown threats that violate the manners and values of normative society. As a theorist of the weird tale, Lovecraft is perhaps second only to Edgar Allan Poe in American letters. Lovecraft's study supernatural horror in literature is a significant achievement by just about any standard. He began working on it around 1924 at the suggestion of a friend, and after 3 years of deep and wide-ranging reading of weird fiction, he published an initial version of the essay in the first and only issue of a magazine called The Recluse. Several years later, a new version of the work was serialized in a small magazine, The Fantasy Fan, but the complete study did not appear in the book form until 1939, when August Derleth and Donald Wandrei posthumous collection of Lovecraft's writings, The Outsider and Others. According to Lovecraft, tales of supernatural horror connect with some primal emotions at the very core of human nature. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. This imbues the weird tale with inherent value as a literary form. Despite the authenticity and dignity of the weird tale, Lovecraft recognizes that the appeal of the spectrally macabre is generally narrow because it demands from the reader a certain degree of imagination and a capacity of detachment from everyday life. Relatively, few are free enough from the spell of the daily routine to respond to rappings from outside. Nevertheless, the weird tale will never fall completely out of favour with the reading public because fear of the unknown is genetically hardwired into human nature. Even if the conscious mind were purged of all sources of wonder, the instinctual genetic drives written into our nervous systems would still compel us to shiver with dread at the dark and shadowy mysteries at the heart of all weird tales. In Lovecraft's view, the true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathlessness and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and pretentiousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and ridiculous suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space. This definition serves as a useful entry into Lovecraft's own fiction. Like Poe before him, Lovecraft does not locate the true centre of his tales in gruesome images of monstrosities, but in the atmosphere they create. In other words, in the effect the tales have on the reader. Lovecraft's aim is to bring readers gradually and carefully to the realization that the world that surrounds us may not be the full portion of the real. The one test of the really weird is simply this: whether or not there be excited in the reader a profound sense of dread and a contact with unknown spheres and powers, a subtle attitude of awed listening, as if for the beating of black wings or the scratching of outside shapes and entities on the known universe's utmost rim. Dread, that strange mixture of terror, horror, and mystery, is the purest response one can feel at the full realization of the human condition. Lovecraft recognizes that there is a tension at the core of every thinking person. We are driven by our desire for knowledge into uncharted territories, but what we discover in those blank spaces on the map are sea monsters waiting to devour us. Better, perhaps, that we embrace our ignorance. In Lovecraft's vision, the true nature of the cosmos is both infinite and monstrously indifferent. The narrator of one of Lovecraft's best-known and most celebrated stories, The Call of Cthulhu, presents the horrific triviality of human life against the vastness of infinite space. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. The sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but some day the piecing together of dissociated knowledge will open up such terrifying vistas of reality and of our frightful position therein, mad from the revelation, or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. Unlike in the works of some of the 19th century Gothic writers, however, Lovecraft's terrors are not the terrors of the devil. They are not rooted in a supernatural struggle between the forces of good and evil. Instead, they arise from the vastness of the cosmos that 19th century science opened up to humanity. The horror we feel is the recognition of our own inconsequence. As the science fiction author and critic Fritz Lieber once observed about Lovecraft, he shifted the focus of supernatural dread from man and his little world and his gods to the stars and the black and unplumbed gulfs of intergalactic space. There is, it might seem to the casual reader of Lovecraft, a strange contradiction at work here. How can an author whose personal education and belief system are so rooted in 19th century science and in philosophical materialism, that is, in the rejection of the supernatural and the belief that physical matter is all that makes up the universe we live in, spend his artistic energies writing tales about strange cults and elder gods and forbidden compendiums of magical spells and occult lore? There is no simple answer to this puzzle, but the search for it takes readers back, first and foremost, to the symbolic nature of the monstrous itself. The so-called elder gods and forbidden books associated with strange decaying New England towns and mysterious universities peopled with professors who pursue knowledge through profane quests are central to the plots of many of Lovecraft's best works. They are disturbing in large part because they are not presented as mere phantoms or fakes, but as real beings who engulf the lives of Lovecraft's characters in real and often horrific ways. They also, however, serve as symbols that remind us of our insignificance within the cosmos and our ignorance of the world in which we live. The Necronomicon, the forbidden book of magic that appears in several of Lovecraft's stories and novellas, serve as a point of entry into the deeper reality that lies just beyond our awareness and that evades the comprehension of all but a few imaginative souls. It is a book to which those who seek hidden or forbidden knowledge turn, and this knowledge is as likely to damn them as it is to save those intrepid seekers, for the human mind cannot adequately process the horrible mysteries of the cosmos. We humans are small, our lives only marginally meaningful, and to Lovecraft's alien gods like Cthulhu, Nyarlathotep, Yog-Sothoth, and Azathoth, we are mere annoyances or playthings if we are lucky, food if we are not. Shadowy cults in Lovecraft's fiction keep the memory of these ancient alien gods alive, and it is the unlucky character who stumbles upon these cults engaging in their strange rituals in the middle of a dark swamp. Lovecraft posits that the human mind is simply incapable of comprehending the furthest reaches of a mysterious cosmos. So, if ultimate truths were revealed to us, we might, like the title character of Facts Concerning the Late Arthur German and his family, immolate ourselves out of fear and despair. In the 21st century, when Cthulhu has become a plush toy and movies make casual references to the Necronomicon as though it were a real book, it is clear that Lovecraft created a body of work with lasting influence. Though he only wrote a few dozen short stories and novellas, Lovecraft is the 20th century's master of the weird tale, and today his place in the American literary canon is secure. And then there's a bit here scientist at the University of Memphis. Previously, he served as chair of the Department of English at the University of Memphis, and earlier he held an endowed professorship at North Georgia College and State University, where he also headed the Department of Language and Literature. A two-time Fulbright Specialist Award recipient, he holds a PhD in American Literature from Purdue University and has authored or edited 8 books, including Understanding Philip K. Dick and the Fast and Terrible Drama American Literary Naturalism, in the late 19th century. So that was the introduction. So our first story here is The Beast in the Cave. The horrible conclusion which had been gradually obtruding itself upon my confused and reluctant mind was now an awful certainty. I was lost, completely, hopelessly lost in the vast and labyrinthine recesses of the mammoth cave. Turn as I might, in no direction could my straining vision seize on any object capable of serving as a guidepost to set me on the outward path. That nevermore should I behold the blessed light of day, or scan the pleasant hills and dales of the beautiful world outside, my reason could no longer entertain the slightest unbelief. Hope had departed, yet indoctrinated as I was by a life of philosophical study, I derived no small measure of satisfaction from my unimpassioned demeanour, for although I had frequently read of the wild frenzies into which were thrown the victims of similar situations, I experienced none of these, but stood quiet as soon as I clearly realized the loss of my bearings. Nor did the thought that I had probably wandered beyond the utmost limits of an ordinary search cause me to abandon my composure even for a moment. If I must die, I reflected, then was this terrible yet majestic cavern as welcome a sepulchre as that which any churchyard might afford, a conception which had carried with it more of tranquillity than of despair. Starving would prove my ultimate fate. Of this I was certain. Some, I knew, had gone mad under circumstances such as these, but I felt that this end would not be mine. My disaster was the result of no fault save my own, since unbeknown to the guide I had separated myself from the regular party of sightseers, and, wandering for over an hour in forbidden avenues of the cave, had found myself unable to retrace the devious windings which I had pursued since forsaking my companions. Already my torch had begun to expire. Soon I would be enveloped by the total and almost palpable blackness of the bowels of the earth. As I stood in the waning unsteady light, I idly wondered over the exact circumstances of my coming end. I remembered the accounts which I had heard of the colony of consumptives who, taking their residence in this gigantic grotto to find health from the apparently salubrious air of the underground world, with its steady, uniform temperature, pure air, and peaceful quiet, had found instead death in strange and ghastly form. I had seen the sad remains of their ill-made cottages as I passed them by with the party, and had wondered what unnatural influence a long sojourn in this immense and silent cavern would exert upon one as healthy and as vigorous as I. Now, I grimly told myself, my opportunity for settling this point had arrived, provided that want of food should not bring me too speedy a departure from this life. As the last fitful rays of my torch faded into obscurity, I resolved to leave no stone unturned, no possible means of escape neglected, so summoning a series of loud shoutings in the vain hope of attracting the attention of the guide by my clamour. Yet, as I called, I believed in my heart that my cries were to no purpose, and that my voice, magnified and reflected by the numberless ramparts of the black maze about me, fell upon no ears save my own. All at once, however, my attention was fixed with a start, as I fancied that I heard the sound of soft approaching steps on the rocky floor of the cavern. Was my deliverance about to be accomplished so soon? Had then all my horrible apprehensions been for naught, and was the guide, having marked my unwarranted absence from the party, following my course and seeking me out in this limestone labyrinth? Whilst these joyful questions arose in my brain, I was on the point of renewing my cries, in order that my discovery might come the sooner, when in an instant my delight was turned to horror as I listened, for my ever-acute ear, now sharpened in even greater degree by the complete silence of the cave, bore to my benumbed understanding the unexpected and dreadful knowledge that these footfalls were not like those of any mortal man. In the unearthly stillness of this subterranean region, the tread of the booted guide would have sounded like a series of sharp and incisive blows. These impacts were soft and stealthy, as of the padded paws of some feline. Besides, at times, when I listened carefully, I seemed to trace the falls of 4 instead of 2 feet. I was now convinced that I had, by my cries, aroused and attracted some wild beast, perhaps a mountain lion, which had accidentally strayed within the cave. Perhaps, I considered, the Almighty had chosen for me a swifter and more merciful death than that of hunger. Yet the instinct of self-preservation, never wholly dormant, was stirred in my breast, and though escape from the oncoming peril might but spare me for a sterner and more lingering end, I determined nevertheless to part with my life at as high a price as I could command. Strange as it may seem, my mind conceived of no intent on the part of the visitor save that of hostility. Accordingly, I became very quiet, in the hope that the unknown beast would, in the absence of a guiding sound, lose its direction as I had, and thus pass me by. But this hope was not destined for realization, for the strange footfalls steadily advanced, the animal evidently having obtained my scent, which in an atmosphere so absolutely free from all distracting influences as is that of the cave, could doubtless be followed at great distance. Seeing, therefore, that I must be armed for defence against any uncanny and unseen attack in the dark, I grouped about me the largest of the fragments of rock which were strewn upon all parts of the floor of the cavern in the vicinity, and, grasping one in each hand for immediate use, awaited with resignation the inevitable result. Meanwhile, the hideous pattering of the paws drew near. Certainly the conduct of the creature was exceedingly strange. Most of the time the tread seemed to be that of a quadruped, walking with a singular lack of unison betwixt hind and 4 feet, yet at brief and infrequent intervals I fancied that but 2 feet were engaged in the process of locomotion. I wondered what species of animal was to confront me. It must, I thought, be some unfortunate beast who had paid for its curiosity to investigate one of the entrances of the fearful grotto, with a lifelong confinement in its interminable recesses. It doubtless obtained as food the eyeless fish, bats, and rats of the cave, as well as some of the ordinary fish that are wafted in at every freshet of green river, which communicates in some occult manner with the waters of the cave. I occupied my terrible vigil with grotesque conjectures of what alterations cave life might have brought in the physical structure of the beast, remembering the awful appearances ascribed by local tradition to the consumptives who had died after the long residence in the cavern. Then I remembered with a start that, even should I succeed in killing my antagonist, I should never behold its form, as my torch had long since been extinct, and I was entirely unprovided with matches. The tension on my brain now became frightful. My disordered fancy conjured up hideous and fearsome shapes from the sinister darkness that surrounded me, and that actually seemed to press upon my body. Nearer and nearer the dreadful footfalls approached. It seemed that I must give vent to a piercing scream, yet had I been sufficiently irresolute to attempt such a thing, my voice could scarce have responded. I was petrified, rooted to the spot. I doubted if my right arm would allow me to hurl its missile at the oncoming thing when the crucial moment should arrive. Now the steady pat and pat of the steps was close at hand. Now very close. I could hear the laboured breathing of the animal, and terror-struck as I was, I realized that it must have come from a considerable distance, and was correspondingly fatigued. Suddenly the spell broke. My right hand, guided by my ever-trustworthy sense of hearing, threw with full force the sharp-angled bit of limestone which it contained, toward that point in the darkness from which emanated the breathing and pattering, and, wonderful to relate, it nearly reached its goal, for I heard the thing jump, landing at a distance away, where it seemed to pause. Having readjusted my aim, I discharged my second missile, this time most effectively, for with a flood of joy I listened as the creature fell in what sounded like a complete collapse, and evidently remained prone and unmoving. Almost overpowered by the great relief which rushed over me, I reeled back against the wall. The breathing continued in heavy gasping inhalations and expirations, whence I realized that I had no more than wounded the creature. And now all desire to examine the thing ceased. At last something allied to groundless superstitious fear had entered my brain, and I did not approach the body, nor did I continue to cast stones at it in order to complete the extinction of its life. Instead, I ran at full speed in what was, as nearly as I could estimate in my frenzied condition, the direction from which I had come. Suddenly I heard a sound, or rather a regular succession of sounds. In another instant they had resolved themselves into a series of sharp metallic clicks. This time there was no doubt. It was the guide. And then I shouted, yelled, screamed, even shrieked with joy as I beheld in the vaulted arches above the faint and glimmering effulgence which I knew to be the reflected light of an approaching torch. I ran to meet the flare, and before I could completely understand what had occurred, was lying upon the ground at the feet of the guide, embracing his boots and gibbering despite my boasted reserve in a most meaningless and idiotic manner, pouring out my terrible story, and at the same time overwhelming my auditor with protestations of gratitude. At length I awoke to something like my normal consciousness. The guide had noted my absence upon the arrival of the party at the entrance of the cave, and had, from his own initiative, sense of direction, proceeded to make a thorough canvass of the passages just ahead of where he had last spoken to me, locating my whereabouts after a quest of about 4 hours. By the time he had related this to me, I, emboldened by his torch and his company, began to reflect by the rustlight's aid what manner of creature was my victim. Accordingly, I retraced my steps, this time with the courage born of companionship, to the scene of my terrible experience. Soon we descried a white object upon the floor, an object whiter than the glimmering limestone itself. Cautiously advancing, we gave vent to a simultaneous ejaculation of wonderment, for all of the unnatural monsters either of us had in our lifetimes beheld, this was in surpassing degree the strangest. It appeared to be an anthropoid ape of large proportions, escaped perhaps from some itinerant menagerie. Its hair was snow-white, a thing due no doubt to the bleaching action of a long existence within the inky confines of the cave, but it was also surprisingly thin, being indeed largely absent save on the head, where it was of such length and abundance that it fell over the shoulders in considerable profusion. The face was turned away from us, as the creature lay almost directly upon it. The inclination of the limbs was very singular, explaining, however, the alternation in their use which I had before noted, whereby the beast used sometimes all four, and on other occasions but two for its progress. From the tips of the fingers or toes long nail-like claws extended. The hands or feet were not apprehensible, a fact that I ascribed to that long residence in the cave which, as I before mentioned, seemed evident from the all-pervading and almost unearthly whiteness so characteristic of the whole anatomy. No tail seemed to be present. The respiration had now grown very feeble, and the guide had drawn his pistol with the evident intent of dispatching the creature, when a sudden sound emulated by the latter caused the weapon to fall unused. The sound was of a nature difficult to describe. It was not like the normal note of any known species of simian, and I wondered if this unnatural quality were not the result of a long-continued and complete silence, broken by the sensations produced by the advent of the light, a thing which the beast could not have seen since his first entrance into the cave. The sound, which I might feebly attempt to classify as a kind of deep-toned chattering, was faintly continued. All at once a fleeting spasm of energy seemed to pass through the frame of the beast. The paws went through a convulsive motion, and the limbs contracted. With a jerk, the white body rolled over, so that his face was turned in our direction. For a moment I was so struck with horror at the eyes thus revealed that I noted nothing else. They were black, those eyes, deep, jetty black, in hideous contrast to the snow-white hair and flesh. Like those of other cave denizens, they were deeply sunken in their orbits, and were entirely destitute of iris. As I looked more closely, I saw that they were set in a face less prognathous than that of the average ape, and infinitely more hairy. The nose was quite distinct. As we gazed upon the uncanny sight presented to our vision, the thick lips opened, and several sounds issued from them, after which the thing relaxed in death. The guide clutched my coat sleeve and trembled so violently that the light shook fitfully, casting weird, moving shadows on the wall about us. I made no motion, but stood rigidly still, my horrified wish to recommend any of your favourites that you would like to hear, I will happily read those for you. But thank you for listening. I hope it relaxed you as much as Lovecraft can. No matter where you are, I hope